Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So I have a confession to make, and that is that I really did not feel I understood sufficiently, and I can only say understood sufficiently because I can't say understood perfectly, that I understood sufficiently the Rashis that we are about to deal with this morning. And so I looked at the translations and I thought about it very carefully. And I do feel that at this point I have a better sense of what Rashi is trying to tell us. And this is an example, it really is an amazing and wonderful example of the kind of extremely sophisticated thinking that goes on in the Talmud. Very radical, radical perhaps is the wrong, rigorous, I suppose I should use the term rigorous, in terms of trying to understand what the Torah is trying to tell us and the implications of it. And of course, we've had examples, but today's examples seem to go a little bit more, they require more careful analysis. And as I said, I feel I have a better understanding. And I also was praying to God that I could explain it to you in a way that you would understand it in the same way. So with that in mind, I'm going to go into the screen share, and I'm so glad you could join me. So we really were really in the middle of a sentence. We had done in the middle of a sentence in the middle of the Rashi, as you can see, and we'll go back and take a look quickly at the verse itself. So we're talking here v'habasar, and the meat of the sacrifice, asher giga b'chol tameh, which touches anything impure. Lo ye'achel, it shall not be eaten. Ba'esh yisaref, it shall be burned in fire. It shall be burned in fire. V'habasar, and with regard to the meat in general, and this is a little bit strange, and I mentioned this yesterday, that the syntax of the sentence isn't the most simple syntax by any means, but as for the meat, kol tahor yochal basar, it says any person who's in a state of purity may eat the meat. And of course, we know, or I just want to refer to it again, is that when we're talking about a shlamim type of sacrifice, where the ba'alim, that is to say, the people who owned the animal to begin with, and who are offering it up as an offering, as a shlamim offering, are given a specific part of, in fact, probably the most of the meat of the animal, just the brisket and the right thigh would go to the Kohen, or the Kohanim involved in the offering. But the rest of the flesh would essentially go back to the owners, the original owners. And of course, there were specific fat parts, essentially, that were offered up on the altar. And that's the reason for shlamim, because shalim means whole, and this means everyone involved in this offering gets part of it. But the Torah is saying, there's some strictures involved. And it gets into this issue of impurity, this arcane subject, which we really don't think about or live with that much, at least not consciously in the way the Torah presents it. It is a really novel idea for us in terms of our culture. So before I go into that, I want to tell you that I was thinking further about the issue of purity and impurity. And I wondered to myself if it has to do with, I believe it's still a scientific, if not philosophical question, which is what exactly is aging? That is to say, if in fact cells reproduce themselves essentially with themselves, then why do people age? Why does the body go through a process which eventually leads to death? What exactly? And in fact, I happen to know that the Buck Institute here in Northern California is devoted to figuring that one out and finding ways to prolong life. And my thought here is that the issues of purity and impurity go well beyond the physical, but go well into the spiritual and mental and psychological elements of life. and that the essential reason why we eventually die and why we age, some, as you know, quicker than others, other than genetics, has to do with impurities. That there are impurities that develop in the system, and those impurities eventually lead to the dissolution of the cells and mortality. So that this issue of purity and impurity is directly linked to the issue of immortality. And that's the theory would be that were we to actually try as best as we could to utilize and put into practice these laws that are involved here, we actually probably would live far longer than we do. Maybe we'd live to 120, I mean, that's possible. But
Well,
yeah, okay, go ahead. I'm basically made my point, so go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I can't help but thinking that, for instance, there are a lot of strains of genetic breast cancers or Parkinson's or other genetic um, disorders within the Jewish population, especially the Ashkenazic Jewish population, and some of the sometimes that shortens people's life, but it also somewhat comes from the culture of, like, the kashrut and other laws that were built to separate you and have you marry other Jewish people and be with other Jewish people and eat with other Jewish people. And I'm kind of simplifying it, but that's kind of what leads to these genetic disorders more than the fact that, like, maybe the Jewish people have been sinning. So, I mean, that's just the line that I'm thinking. We can get into a discussion or not, but that's the line that I'm thinking that I needed to share.
No. And I think, for honest discussion, you needed to share that. So that is the question. That is the question. My understanding is that, so that's basing it simply on physical, I believe, for the most part, physical conditions that are involved in analyzing, the human makeup and et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, are there other things that play a part in it? And is it rather a situation that would be indicative? Whether or not, I mean, clearly there are really strict laws, against incest within the Jewish community. Um, I am not sufficiently, an expert in any of these particular topics. It was just a thought. It's a theory, but it seemed, at least from the literal point, the literary point of view here of what we're discussing, I was trying to make better sense of why the issues of purity and impurity are so important. David?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating, I mean, it's fascinating thought. I guess there's also to Lauren's point as well, there's the physical impurity and the spiritual impurity. So I guess that my question would be, along the same lines kind of is, like if you took an animal, for example, not necessarily, well, let's say an animal, and you put it into an environment that's totally free of any impurities, right? You never let it out of that environment, and you made sure that it was fed completely, pure food to, the best of possible. Everything is pure of physical impurity. So, your point, and just, extrapolating that, is that animal should live, like much longer than, animals around it that are not being, treated the same way. So that's kind of the physical impurity aspect. So, I mean, is that part of it? And then there's also the spiritual impurity, or is it, combination of both? I'm just thinking. So anyway.
Right. So I think it's primarily the emotional side here that we're talking about, the spiritual side. I'm thinking, for example, the sense of guilt, right, that can drive a person crazy, and affect the length of their lives, their mortality. They're trying to live a life where you don't do things that really can hurt you very much. I was interested to know that I learned at one point that people who are involved, actually engage in the pornographic industry, that the men tend to live a lot shorter lives, that the level of mortality is quite high there. I mean, the point, though, is that it isn't just physical factors, especially if we're talking about human beings, that as human beings, we're so complicated and we're such really beautiful, each one of us is such a beautiful combination of emotional and physical and rational elements. And to try and bring all those elements into harmony is actually something that gives life purpose. That another, to just using various metaphors and ways of expressing what the religious enterprise is about. One of the things that I found more helpful more recently is to say, look, believing in God has a lot to do with asking ourselves, what's our relationship to the universe? What's our place in the universe, right? And being able to accept the notion of transcendency, which is a belief it's directly related to saying, if I think, what allows me to think? If I speak, why am I created? How did I become that? And even if we can explain all those things, by way of evolution, nevertheless, the very fact that there is evolution, it still can beg a transcendent question, which is, so how did the world come into existence so that it supports the notion of evolution? And intelligent life, for that matter, of any kind of level, and just looking at nature and its variety and its et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to take too much time in that, but I wanted to give us, as I was meditating about this, to give us a little something extra to consider, especially because the issue of purity and impurity, the way the Torah is dealing with it, is such an arcane subject and so hard for people to appreciate, at least in our modern sense, it seems. So let me go into this now. Let's go back into this. So we were talking in this verse about, this is talking in this part of the verse where it says, Kol tahor yochal basar. Any person who is in a pure state can eat this meat of the sacrifice, of the shlamim sacrifice. So it says, here we go. This is from the Talmud now, Psachim, Pesach, right? Ma Talmud lomar. So the question is, what is the point of this statement in the Torah where it says this? I mean, it isn't that we wouldn't realize this even without the statement, but it says, Lefi shene'emar, and the reason it states this is because in Deuteronomy chapter 12, where it's talking about a similar kind of subject, it says, V'zdam zevachecha yishafech, or yishpoch. I'd have to actually look at this. So, or probably yishafech, I'm going to guess, right? Meaning the blood of your sacrifices shall be poured out, right? And there's, of course, a prohibition against actually consuming blood. V'habasar tochal, and you shall eat the meat. Now, this particular statement that you shall eat the meat, it isn't the meat shall be eaten. It says you shall eat the meat. And because it's talking about the practice, right? It's talking here about the blood of the sacrifice. And this was essentially done by the people involved. Let's say it was done by the priests, but essentially that the context of the statement is the people who are involved in bringing the sacrifice, meaning the owners, the priests, etc. And that the implication would be, and here I'm going to read the Rashi, Yachol lo yuchlu shamim ela haba'alim, that one might infer from that the only people entitled to eat that meat are the people who brought the meat themselves. That is the Ba'alim, the one who owned the sacrifice to begin with. Lechach ne'emar, and for this reason it's stated, Kol tahor yochal basor, that anyone who is in a state of purity may eat the meat. Now, I'm going to, assuming that I'm correct about this, it's saying that, it seems to be saying to me, the way this is stated by Rashi, is that if let's say that I'm the owner of this particular offering, and I'm given the meat to consume within a certain, we know that we only have a certain period of time in which to consume that meat, I can invite anyone who is in a pure state to come and eat the meat with me. That's what this seems to be saying, because it says, kol tahor, anyone who is in a pure state. And that this statement, what the chiddush, that is to say, the new idea, that the novel idea that this little phrase is coming to tell us, is that it isn't just the people who own the sacrifice who must be in a state of purity in order to consume the meat, but in fact, what the Torah is doing is giving permission for anyone who is in a state of purity to consume the meat of the sacrifice. Now, fair warning, I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but that certainly seems to be what Rashi is saying here, and what the Talmud, as how we're understanding the Talmud in this particular case. So this is an example of some of the close analysis. So let's keep going. Here we go. So here's another, I assume that this comes from possibly other manuscripts, okay? V'habasar kol tahor yuchal basar. And with regards to the meat, any person who is pure may consume the meat. Klomar, that is to say, kol ma she'asarti lecha b'chatat v'asham. That is to say, so in other words, it's like saying, and however, so let me just translate though, I wasn't doing that there. That is to say, Klomar, that is to say, kol ma she'asarti lecha, all that which I forbid you, asarti, to forbid a person, b'chatat v'asham, regarding the chatat offering, the sin offering, v'asham, and the guilt offering, she'im yatzu chutz lakilayim, because, okay, so this is something that was forbidden regarding those two types of offerings. What was the specific prohibition? She'im yatzu chutz lakilayim, that if in fact the meat of those things, I assume is what it's talking about, or once it's in the process of being slaughtered and sacrificed, that if they go outside the curtains, literally the curtains, but what it means is the courtyard of the temple. Ultimately, that's what it's going to mean, the courtyard. Asura, it's forbidden. So again, when it came to Chatat and Asham, the Kohanim were the ones who could actually and were commanded to consume the part of the offering that went to the Kohanim, that they could not take it outside the courtyard. They couldn't eat it outside the courtyard. It had to be eaten in the courtyard. Kemoshe Katuv, as is stated, B'chatzar Ohel Moed. So in the context of Exodus, all right, or wherever, right, it says in the courtyard of the tent of meeting, yochluha, they should eat it. In other words, the Kohanim are commanded to eat that meat in the courtyard. B'basar zeh ani omer lacha. With regards to this particular meat, I am saying to you, I tell you, kol tahor yuchal basar, that anyone who's in a state of purity can eat the meat, afilu b'kol ha'ir, even throughout the precincts of Jerusalem. They can be outside the temple. Lauren, is your hand up, or did you want to? Okay, all right. So this is another way of understanding this particular circumlocution and statement in the text here. And I'll take a little bit more. I'm probably going to run out of time though. So thank goodness we have tomorrow. Okay, next verse. V'hanefesh asher tochal basar, and the soul which consumes meat. Mizevach hashlamim. Now we're talking about the shlamim offering, right? Of the shlamim offering, asher lashem, which is, in other words, the shlamim offering that was offered up to God. The tum'ato alav, and he is in a state of tumah, of impurity. And of course, elsewhere through Leviticus, we read many examples of how one can actually become tameh, become impure. There are many ways, okay? So if such a person is in a state of impurity, the nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha, that soul shall be cut off from its people. So there is a divine punishment associated with a person who is impure and is eating sacrificial meat or sacrificial food. And in general, when one approaches, it's interesting, right, that a place such as the temple, which is there to enhance life unbelievably, can I say enhance life unbelievably, nevertheless has many laws and many rules that, if they're not properly taken care of, actually may lead to the cessation of life. And that to look at life as something extremely precious and extremely complex, and to treat it like that, not like a bull, and we can't go through life like a bull in a china shop. I'm going to stop here only because it's a major area. So I'm going to set the marking here for, please God, tomorrow, and we'll deal with this particular sentence and how Rashi deals with it. I'm going to stop the share. Any thoughts, any comments on this? Lauren, if are you talking? I'm sorry.
I'm thinking about how the prayer services are sort of weaker substitutes for the sacrifices. So it's not the exact same thing as bringing a sacrifice to the temple, but we're not supposed to come to the prayer services with impurity, in a sense. Like, in other words, we're not going to be cut off, and we may not be doing it on purpose. We may not be aware of what the differences between purity and impurity are, but what it says to me is it's something to, like, try to be conscious of.
Right.
The to kind of, like, you can't eliminate hypocrisy because you just can't help it, it's a human trait, but you can try to be aware of trying to match your level of intent, at least of purity, with attendance of prayer services, and to try to
Yeah, keep going. Go ahead.
yeah, it's just kind of hard to explain what I'm talking about, but it's not exactly the same thing, but it I think it points to this.
Right. No, I think that trying to find ways in which to make this, in fact, is a part of course, what we're doing. What I'm trying to do with you in studying it like this. So, yeah. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Give me a moment. So.